Today's video is sponsored by NordVPN. Give yourself options online. Go to nordvpn.com/bio to get a 2-year plan at a huge discount, plus a free gift. More on them in a bit. When the Beatles first landed in the US, a guy who knew one or two things about music was unimpressed, predicting their metaphorical death. That guy was Frank Sinatra, who would later change his mind and even cover their songs. His favourite track was Something from the Abbey Road album. Before performing the song, he would introduce it as his favourite Lennon-McCartney song. Good choice, Frank. The only problem is that Something had been written and composed by George Harrison, the band's lead guitarist. This anecdote best captures the career and legacy of George Harrison. Known as the Choir Beatle, his musical contribution was often overlooked, fading in the shadow cast by those songwriting giants, John Lennon and Paul McCartney. But as we'll learn in today's episode, George was far from being a wallflower, and his musical talents was on par with the greatest stars of the 1960s and 1970s musical scene. George Harrison was born on February 25th, 1943 in Liverpool, Northern England. He was the youngest of 4 children, born to Harold, a bus driver and trade union official, and to Louise, a grocery store clerk. George's childhood was relatively peaceful and stable, but the Harrisons were not by any means wealthy, and their house in Liverpool was small, cramped, and terribly cold. George's parents signed him up at Dovedale Primary School, the same one attended by John Lennon, but George was 3 years his junior, and the two never met there. Another Dovedale schoolmate remembered George as being a quiet guy who nonetheless possessed a great sense of humour and liked to cause mischief. More importantly, he had a strong moral compass, defending schoolmates against bullies. In 1949, the Harrisons moved to Speke, southeast of Liverpool. George continued with his studies, winning a place at the prestigious Liverpool Institute in 1954. But young George did not fit in well in this new environment. In plain terms, he was dead bored. An intense love for popular music had swept away any interest in academics. As teachers lectured away, the skinny teenager filled his notebooks with drawings of guitars and lyrics from his favourite Elvis Presley songs. George's musical epiphany happened at the age of 13. While cycling around his neighbourhood, he heard Heartbreak Hotel by Elvis drifting from an open window. It hit him like a double-decker bus. He knew what he wanted to be in life. He wanted to be a guitarist. The young Harrison started dressing up as a teddy boy, sporting drainpipe trousers and a quiff. He listened avidly to Chuck Berry and Buddy Holly, as well as the early all-British Skiffle records. For the uninitiated, Skiffle is a subgenre of American folk music, often played with rudimentary and improvised instruments. After a surge in popularity in the 1920s, Skiffle enjoyed a revival in Britain in the 1950s. George wanted rock, or Skiffle, or both, and to do that he needed money, encouragement, and, well, a guitar. He received all three from his parents, especially Louise, who part-timed as a ballroom dancing instructor and was happy to indulge George's musical inclination. And so the Harrisons bought George's first guitar for £3. Not a small sum in times of post-war rationing. He taught himself the first chords, and his 6-string beauty became his entire world. In Harrison's own words, "When I was a kid growing up, the guitar was the main thing that saved me from boredom. It was the only job I could think of that I wanted to do, playing guitar and being in a rock band." Eventually, George graduated from the Liverpool Institute with only 1 O-level in art. Rather than continuing his studies, he apprenticed as an electrician. But attendance to the Liverpool Institute had one positive consequence. While riding the bus back from school, George befriended an older schoolmate who he described as an upperclassman. That posh boy was none other than Paul McCartney. Paul's first impressions of George were of a cocky little guy with a good sense of himself. He wasn't cowed by anything. By the time George and Paul had become friends, the former had started taking his first steps in showbiz. George and his brother Peter had formed a band, Johnny and the Rebels. Their debut gig was at the British Legion Club in Speke. They had prepared just 2 songs because it was meant to be an audition, but when the main band failed to show up, they were asked to perform. They played those 2 songs over and over and returned home with bellies full of ale and pockets stuffed with 10 shillings each. Meanwhile, the foundations of the Beatles were being laid. In July 1957, Paul McCartney joined the Quarrymen, John Lennon's Skiffle band. In February of 1958, the group needed a new guitarist, and Paul suggested that they audition George. Lennon was not thrilled, as he didn't want a 14-year-old kid in his band, but he agreed to give him a chance, and an audition was organised. 3 future Beatles met on the top floor of a double-decker bus, and John asked the newbie to play Raunchy by Bill Justice. When George launched into the twangy lead guitar riff, John gave his approval, but Lennon later admitted that he didn't care much for George at the beginning. "I couldn't be bothered with him when he first came around. It took me years to come around to him, to start considering him as an equal." Shortly after the audition, the Quarrymen abandoned Skiffle for the more promising rock and roll genre. Wise move, as the combo was booked for a series of local gigs throughout 1959. In May 1960, the band changed its name to the Silver Beetles and launched a 2-week tour in Scotland. That summer, the band was joined by drummer Pete Best. They were now a quintet. In addition to Best, there was George John Paul and the original bassist, Stuart Sutcliffe. The Silver Beetles were gaining in confidence and skill, so much so that their agent, Allan Williams, organised a residency at 2 clubs in Hamburg, Germany, the Indra and the Kaiserkeller. George played his first German gig on August 17, 1960. By then, the band had dropped the silver from their name and altered the spelling to Beatles with an A instead of Beatles with a double E. This was a homage to the Beat Generation. Harrison and the guys played for 8 hours straight on stage for £2.50 a day. Not a fortune, but aged only 17, George was earning more than his parents. And there was another priceless reward: the crowds of rowdy, yet adoring teenagers, mostly girls. Soon the Beatles developed a reputation for rocking the brains out of their audiences, clearly outclassing every other band imported from Britain. George knew it, mocking rival musicians as being crummy. He only had words of appreciation for the drummer of Rory, Storm and the Hurricanes, though, one Richard Starkley. Hey, Ringo Starr. George gained confidence also in another aspect of rock and roll life: getting on with the ladies. It was in Hamburg that he lost his virginity. The other Beatles were in the room pretending to ignore him, but could not help themselves from applauding at the end. So, rock and roll, check. Sex, check. What was missing? Drugs, of course. To keep up with the demands of the Kaiserkeller Club, George started taking prescription stimulants, which would cause him to froth at the mouth and to hallucinate. The time spent in Hamburg was also a time of cultural growth for George. Due to his young age, he became a sort of mascot for a group of young intellectuals, including art student Astrid Kircher. Thanks to their influence, the Beatles honed their image, ditching teddy boy quiffs for a look inspired by Parisian existentialists. And with that, the Beatles haircut was born. Something else far deeper was born in Hamburg, though: the power dynamics within the band. Lennon and McCartney already started competing for preeminence within the band, a duel fought with lyrics and melodies as weapons of choice. Harrison, still a junior member, was relegated to the back seat. But from there, he observed, listened, and learned, and he developed his signature lead guitar style, one that eschewed fretboard gymnastics, preferring carefully crafted riffs and short solos in which every single note had a purpose and every lick had a story. But this early adventure was doomed to be short-lived. In October 1960, the Beatles were booked by a new club, the Top Ten. Their Kaiserkeller promoter, Bruno Koschmider, was furious for this betrayal and he got revenge. He snitched to the police that Harrison was still a minor, resulting in his expulsion. McCartney and Best retaliated by setting a condom on fire in one of Koschmider's venues, which resulted in their expulsion as well. By December 1960, the Beatles were reunited in Liverpool, performing at the legendary Cavern Club. Amongst the screaming, sweaty teenagers sat one proud mum, Mrs. Harrison, singing along with the other fans. The apple of her eye could not stay 17 forever, though. In April of 1961, once George had turned 18, the band returned to Hamburg. Now, quick question for you. How many times have you been on the internet and noticed creepy ads that seem to be following you around and tailored to your search history? Or, speaking of search history, how many times have you been worried that somebody, maybe even your government, is tracking the websites that you visit? Well, fortunately for you, today's video is sponsored by NordVPN, which is helping to give internet users all the tricks and tools of a proper 21st century online experience. Now, you may have heard me talk about what NordVPN could do for you previously: encrypt your internet data, move your activity to another location with just one click, either for superior security or more streaming options, and all that's still true. NordVPN has more than 5,000 servers in 60 countries, but VPNs give you access to so many more options than just new TV shows, even though that is fantastic. Having trouble connecting to social media where you live? NordVPN. Want to buy a movie that's cheaper somewhere else, or maybe not even available in your country? NordVPN. Want to route your connection through multiple servers just for double-layered protection? Yeah, NordVPN does it. With NordVPN, you can access it all, and that includes utilizing their threat protection upgrade, which blocks ads, eradicates web trackers, checks for malware, and more. Right now, as part of a special deal, you guys can get a 2-year plan at a huge discount, plus an additional bonus gift on top of that. And if you try Nord and change your mind, they offer a 30-day money-back guarantee. All you got to do is go to nordvpn.com/bio. Again, that's nordvpn.com/bio for a 2-year deal at a huge discount, plus a free bonus gift on top of that. Or just follow the link below. And now back to today's video. In June, they had their chance to record their first single, My Bonnie, which attracted the attention of Liverpudlian record shop owner Brian Epstein. The band was invited back to their hometown by Epstein. In the meanwhile, Sutcliffe had decided to leave the band to marry his early muse, Astrid Kircher. Paul took on bass, and Epstein took them under his wing in November 1961, paving the way for the big break of the Beatles. In February 1962, Brian sent an audition tape to major record label Decca, which was famously rejected. It was a hard blow for the band, but Lennon later recalled how it was George who kept everybody's spirits up. Luckily, they listened to him, and they persevered. Another demo tape was well received by Parlophone, an offshoot of EMI. In May 1962, the band signed a record deal, and in June they started their first recording sessions. During these early sessions, they were assigned a Parlophone producer, George Martin, and he asked them, "Let me know if there's anything you don't like." George Harrison replied, "Well, for a start, I don't like your tie." The two Georges did not get on well, but one thing they did agree on was Pete Best was not the right drummer for the Beatles. When Martin raised the issue with the other band members, Harrison enthusiastically suggested they hire his old pal from Hamburg, Ringo Starr. Sometime in early September, a large Beatle fan showed up backstage at the Cavern Club and asked where Pete Best was. Harrison replied, "Oh, we sacked him," to which the fan socked him in the eye and just left. George's black eye can be seen on a September 1962 cover of the magazine Merseybeat. In October 1962, the Beatles released their first successful single, Love Me Do. Before long, Beatlemania had started, and the nation to embrace it most enthusiastically would be the US. The Fab Four from Liverpool started their tour across the Atlantic in February 1964, leaving a profound mark since appearing on The Ed Sullivan Show. On that occasion, George was suffering from flu, which almost prevented him from playing and made it difficult for him to speak at all. Hence, the press and the public immediately dubbed him the Quiet Beatle, which wasn't exactly true, but it matched his serious, dark persona and his growing dislike for the excesses of Beatlemania. He was in it for the music, and he soon grew tired of the constant barrage of unwanted public attention and hysterically screaming fans. His sense of frustration was made worse by still being considered a junior partner when it came to songwriting. Producer George Martin always gave precedence to the compositions by John and Paul, but Harrison was undeterred. His first solo writing credit with the Beatles was Don't Bother Me, written in August. Harrison's contribution to the Beatles' sound, however, was not limited to penning songs. He also enriched his bandmates' compositions with carefully crafted riffs and solos. And he expanded the sonic palette of their productions by introducing new instruments and equipment. For example, in 1964, he picked up the Rickenbacker 12-string guitar and later introduced to the Beatles' sounds the Moog and ARP synthesizers. But the instrument which became the trademark of the Harrison sound was the sitar, the stringed instrument central to Indian traditional music. George had first picked it up while shooting the film Help, but he only started formal training on the instrument after meeting sitar virtuoso Ravi Shankar in June of 1966. George had been married since January 1966 with British model Pattie Boyd, who encouraged him to expand his interest in Indian culture beyond the musical realm and into a spiritual quest. Harrison started studying yoga and meditation, attended lectures, and visited India in September of 1966. By August of the following year, George had converted the other three Beatles to the practice of transcendental meditation, popularized by the guru Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. In February of 1968, the band travelled to Rishikesh in India, where they spent several weeks of study and meditation with the Maharishi himself. Ringo and Paul left the retreat early, but Lennon and Harrison remained until April. That's when a scandal erupted with allegations that the Maharishi had made improper sexual advances towards actress Mia Farrow. John and George left Rishikesh, and in June the band made a statement distancing themselves from their guru. George, however, would later cast doubts on the allegations and continued to support and fund his movement. It could be argued that George Harrison's interest in Indian music and culture was almost entirely responsible for their influence on the counterculture movement of the 1960s, and his spiritual activism may have inspired, in turn, John Lennon's own activism. The Indian and Eastern influences, however, can be clearly appreciated on Harrison's musical development. For example, the lyrics of While My Guitar Gently Weeps were inspired by the Chinese classic Book of Changes, or I Ching, and what is perhaps Harrison's most famous song, Here Comes the Sun, features unusual time signatures such as 11/8 and 7/8. These were borrowed from traditional Indian music. At the same time, George was developing a musical life outside of the confines of the Fab Four, forging friendships with legends Bob Dylan and Eric Clapton. Clapton collaborated with George on his first solo album, Wonderwall Music, of 1968, inspired by Indian music and blues rock. This record was followed by a radical change in direction, 1969's electronic sound, an atmospheric and sometimes disturbing avant-garde piece entirely performed on a Moog 3-piece synthesizer. So all fine and dandy on the solo music production, but the home front was not going well. George was a man of contrasts, and in this period they were particularly exaggerated. At times he plunged into ascetic meditation, fueled by an increasingly dogmatic spiritual outlook. Other times he liked to party hard and indulge in drugs, especially LSD and cannabis. On March the 12th, 1969, Harrison's house was raided by the police and the guitarist was charged with illegal possession of weed. All the while, George and his wife Pattie were unsuccessfully trying to conceive a child. The accumulating tensions led to the deterioration of their marriage, which progressed in parallel with the gradual dissolution of the Beatles. During the last 2 years of activity of the band, 1969 and 1970, Harrison frequently clashed with Lennon and McCartney. As usual, George's compositions were overlooked or modified by John and Paul. Harrison retaliated by pointing out that since Yoko Ono had entered the picture, Lennon's creative juices had just dried up. Harrison vented his frustrations in a new song, Wah Wah, which made it clear how the Lennon-McCartney duo didn't hear him sighing, a reference to his music and spiritual contributions. Wah Wah didn't make it to any of the last two Beatles albums, Abbey Road and Let It Be. It instead enriched the vast catalogue of unpublished Harrison tunes, which would soon see the light of day. In April 1970, the Beatles announced their split. Music fans worldwide mourned, but George was ready to go solo. In November, he released his third album, All Things Must Pass. This triple LP contains the popular track My Sweet Lord, which unfortunately was at the centre of a lawsuit. In February 1971, label Bright Tunes Music sued Harrison as the song was too similar to He's So Fine by the Chiffons. But the album contains more than 100 minutes of damn fine tunes. And look out for Harrison's first use of the slide guitar, which would become a signature technique. Most of the album had been composed at George's new lavish residence, Friar Park, an extravagant neo-Gothic mansion in Henley-on-Thames, Oxfordshire. George loved spending weeks of solitude and relaxation behind its walls, tending to the vast gardens. Always a man of contrasts, George could spend a fortune on a new home, but at the same time dedicate great energy to alleviate the plight of the poor and the desperate. In August of 1971, with the help of Ravi Shankar, Bob Dylan, and Ringo Starr, he organised 2 charity concerts in New York, collecting aid for the victims of floods in Bangladesh. The events would set the template for future rock charity concerts. Think of things like Live Aid. Professional success was counterpointed by further personal misery, however. His relationship with Pattie took a huge hit in 1974 when she left him for his good friend Eric Clapton. But Harrison did not really have the moral high ground. He had been having several affairs, including one with Ringo Starr's wife, Maureen. In that same year, George undertook a tour in North America with Ravi Shankar. Harrison disappointed fans by refusing to play any Beatles songs while starting to feel the strain of life on the road. The tour was a failure, but it had a silver lining. While preparing it, George met Olivia Trinidad Arias, a marketing manager with A&M Records. Olivia captured George's interest thanks to a shared interest in meditation. Moreover, she was able to exert positive influence on Harrison, curbing his excessive consumption of alcohol and drugs. When George and Pattie Boyd eventually divorced in 1977, he was ready to fully embrace a new life with Olivia. On August 1st, 1978, they welcomed their baby boy, Darnie, and 1 month later, they married at Henley's registry office. George was at his happiest when he could just chill with his family and spend long hours gardening in his Friar Park estate. So much so that Darnie, as a little boy, had no idea that his father was a world-famous rock star. He recalled, "I was pretty sure he was just a gardener." Besides gardening, George expanded his endeavours into other forms of artistic expression. In 1979, he co-founded movie production company Handmade Films. It was thanks to Handmade that Monty Python could produce Life of Brian, a religious satire which no other company dared funding. Harrison and Handmade produced other successes like Time Bandits, The Long Good Friday, and With Nell and I. But Harrison also bankrolled stinkers like Shanghai Surprise, one of several wrong decisions which eventually bankrupted Handmade Films. In 1980, George also picked up the typewriter, authoring his autobiography, I, Me, Mine. In it, he avoided any mention of John Lennon, to which the former Beatle took great offence. Harrison tried to contact him to resolve their issues, but fate got in the way in the shape of a gunman, Mark David Chapman, who shot Lennon on December 8, 1980. Now the Beatles were truly history. George continued to compose throughout the 1980s, releasing 2 solo albums, 1 compilation, and 2 records with a supergroup of super musical friends, the Travelling Wilburys. The band was founded in April 1988 as brainchild of Harrison and Jeff Lynne of Electric Light Orchestra. The duo recruited 3 musicians, which you may have heard of, Roy Orbison, Tom Petty, and Bob Dylan. The Wilburys were anything but travelling, as they never went on tour, but their success encouraged George to organise his last ever set of gigs. Despite the Boyd-Clapton affair, the two guitarist friends had never fallen out, and they decided to tour Japan in 1991 and 1992. This would be the last time that George performed in public. His health had already started to deteriorate, and in 1997 he was diagnosed with throat cancer as a result of a life of excesses and heavy smoking. The initial treatment was successful, but it would be a short-lived respite. In the early hours of December 30th, 1999, Michael Abram, a paranoid schizophrenic, managed to sneak into Friar Park armed with a kitchen knife. Harrison tackled the intruder, but Abram fought him off and stabbed him 40 times, puncturing one of his lungs. Luckily, Olivia intervened, knocking out the would-be killer with a table lamp. Harrison recovered quickly from the attack, quicking that Abram certainly wasn't auditioning for the travelling Wilburys. But according to Olivia, the wounds only contributed to George's declining health. In fact, his cancer returned, this time affecting his lungs and later his brain. After further treatment in Switzerland and the United States, George Harrison died in Los Angeles on November 29, 2001. His spirits were up until the very end. Shortly before his death, he was cracking jokes with his old pal Ringo Starr. According to George's wishes, his ashes were dispersed in the River Ganges. At the peak of his artistic activity with the Beatles, George Harrison may have struggled to have his voice heard, but he was successful in steadily building a legacy of profound, inspiring music spanning at least 4 different genres. 10 years after his death, Dhani Harrison returned to Friar Park and noted how the garden had never looked better. The trees planted by his father had finally grown. He remarked, "You don't build a garden for yourself right now. You build a garden for future generations. My father definitely had a long view."